Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Dakari Aarons, the Director of Education Policy and Partnerships at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. We're here today to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on education and especially the implications for equity and policy. To say the past year has been a game changer for education is an understatement. Because of the pandemic, we've seen immense disruption in how and where students learn, and we know that these impacts have especially been felt by Black, Brown, and Indigenous students and those who are living in poverty. I'm really pleased to be joined this afternoon by two experts in education, policy, and practice to talk about what we've learned over the past year and how we might move toward a more equitable education future. Denise Fort is the Senior Vice President for Partnership and Engagement at the Education Trust, which is a national education advocacy organization focused on improving education for students of color and students who are living in poverty. We're also joined by Jacob Allen, who is the co-founder and CEO of Pilot Schools in Indianapolis. Pilot Ed Schools, is a national elementary school network focused on transforming student outcomes through path-changing academics and identity development. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. Jacob, I'm going to start with you. Building a student's sense of identity, I know, is really important to how you approach your work at Pilot Ed, and obviously we're used to doing this work inside of a physical classroom. How have you and the educators in your schools been tackling this over the past year, having to shift to using technology to build relationships with students?
Thank you for having me, Dakari. Yeah, since the pandemic has really hit the educational landscape over this past year, we've really had to make sure that we had to reformat and reinvent the entire learning experience. And I think when it first happened, some of the things that we were asking ourselves was, how do we move a rigorous math lesson online, or how do we move engaging English language arts lesson online? And we quickly realized that while we were able to do that, albeit it took some technology kind of shifts and it took some additional professional development for our teachers and for our families, we also quickly realized that there were a large amount of the pieces of the school environment that were really hard to kind of recreate. Some of these things were field trips, visits to the school farm. We were growing over 30 different fruits and vegetables, last year, and we needed to harvest them. And then the pandemic hit, and we were starting to think about, how can we actually have science lab hours virtually? How can we bring small pods of students in, keep them socially distanced, as well as in face masks, and then actually harvest the vegetables from the garden, make sure that they engage with the school goats and chickens, because what we started to realize was that these pieces that may have seemed like a part of the school day and maybe not as important to some other schools as math and English, were massively important to the well-being of our students. And since we've started the program, are really massively important to the academic success of our students. It wasn't just about the farm being enjoyable or recess being fun for kids. They were actually like massive parts of the learning environment. And so when we started to recreate that, reformat that, we noticed that families, their engagement started to go up. We noticed that students stopped kind of calling into Zoom calls sad and kind of crying, saying they missed each other. They were actually able to start making those connections, starting to increase their well-being at home. And we started to say, hey, this isn't going anywhere. We're going to have to take everything online, or at least take it into small pods in the school. Otherwise, our students are going to suffer academically, mentally, emotionally. And so I'm happy we were able to kind of make that pivot and do it pretty quickly.
Absolutely. And how have you seen, teachers really embrace technology to make that happen for students?
Yeah, I think we are in a fortunate position, not necessarily us as Pilot Ed, but more so kind of as a society where, we've had to use technology already in some minimal ways maybe, but now in some more expansive ways to make sure that the educational environment, the learning experience could be had virtually. And so, we've provided teachers with, on-demand support, whether it's a call, a video chat that crashes in the moment, or having those backup devices to make sure that those virtual lessons are actually good to go. And I think, the larger kind of technology play that had to occur was really everyone owning where they were on their journey when it came to IT. There were a lot of teachers who said, hey, I'm used to this. Like, throw me on any platform. I will be able to keep this lesson at a high rigor level and like super enjoyable. While we had other people early in their journey saying, I've only really used a smartboard and maybe once. What am I going to do to make sure that I'm engaging? And so we actually had some really good cross collaboration moments where, at every Friday we have reflection moments specifically around IT, what went well, what didn't go well. And you saw teachers kind of partnering with other teachers and partnering with admin so that they can not only troubleshoot, but kind of like raise their own bar, if you will, on the quality of their lessons held in the virtual environment.
Absolutely. And Denise, we know that unfortunately there are millions of students around the country who have not been able to have the same experience. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and what policymakers might do to help address this?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you today. I just want to step back for a moment because I think Jacob brought up a really, really compelling issue. Our students and families um, have really, really bared the brunt of this pandemic. Not only this pandemic, but students of color are having to deal with um, 400 years of anti-blackness that came about with the racial reckoning as people were learning more and seeing more about George Floyd and others who we lost last summer. They're also dealing with food insecurity and housing insecurity. A lot of these inequities were there before, but again, the pandemic has really brought them to light and made clear that many of these students have deep structural, or the system itself has been a deep structural barrier for many of them to continue their learning. One of the great things that has been available has been the E-rate, which is a program run out of the FCC, which ultimately has been enabled schools and libraries to take advantage of the E-rate program and help them deliver broadband and deliver devices and give greater access to schools who are using technology. You know, because of the pandemic and schools being closed, um, it sort of turned that on edge, and we realized that the digital divide has become much deeper, much wider for many of our communities. In fact, we know that um, we probably, if we wanted to do this right, need close to $16 billion to really close the digital divide. And the E-rate is one significant part of it. What I'm glad to be able to share is at least in Washington, D.C., just this past week, the House of Representatives was getting closer to making sure we can make E-rate a reality and make it not just a reality but meaningful for so many students of color.
Absolutely. And I know that a lot of us in education have been talking about a desire to build back better as students return into classrooms. Jacob, I'm interested from your perspective as an educator, what sort of things would you want policymakers to support you in doing as you're thinking about how schools should change now that we're a year into experiencing this pandemic?
Yeah, great question. And also I really want to highlight something that Denise just said, which was we've really had to redefine what the classroom learning environment looks like. And so when you think about a program like E-rate, which Denise was able to hit on, that's built for the school environment, the physical brick and mortar school environment in terms of providing the necessary equipment and IT for the environment. And when you think about all of a sudden now, maybe even post pandemic, there are a large swath of students who are saying, hey, we're going to keep our kids at home for another month or another year. You really have to kind of redefine some of the policies that were made for the brick and mortar environment. And so I think I'd really start there. When you actually start looking at things like special education law, when you start looking at things like discipline, when you start looking at things like attendance, right? These are in-person experiences and have been since, for the beginning of education. And I think on the periphery for a long time, you've had some virtual schools. whether it's in the public sector or the public charter sector or private, you see that virtual learning has been around, but a lot of these policies were not built for that. And so when I think about some of the things that I really push onto policymakers, it's starting to actually go through with a fine-tooth comb these policies that were made for the in-person environment, and actually seeing how they impact students, specifically students of color and students in impoverished neighborhoods, where they were attending an in-person environment and now are having to abide by some of these same policies that really don't fit. And if they do fit, we're kind of seeing them done in kind of a haphazard way across districts, across states, and not being kind of held with fidelity across all student bodies. And then the kind of second thing I would really push is this pandemic really brought to light, regardless of kind of geographical location for students, issues of mental health, for families, issues of mental health for students, and definitely for educators and those in the building. And what we started to see, at least here at Pilot Ed, is that if we tried to focus on the actual virtual learning environment along the things of reading and math, and also even if we tried to include some of that other SEL for students, that we weren't doing enough, and we had to quickly adapt to make sure that we were doing enough for the adults in the building and for families at home who were saying, hey, I don't know if I'm gonna have enough, money for food at the end of the day. I don't know if I'm gonna actually have, the wherewithal to be a teacher at the same time of bringing my students to work, my own kids to work, and having to, teach 20 kids at home and 20 kids in person. And you start thinking about stress, and you start thinking about some of these other pressures. And, if the school isn't going to adapt, you have to think about what other areas of that person's workplace, or in this case, the student's school, are going to adapt to meet the mental health needs of our students. And I think I've seen some schools do it well. I think I've seen some districts do it well. And I think if we can kind of double down on those practices and make them kind of the standard when it comes to the way that we have looked at the teaching profession and the students and families at home, I think we could do a lot when it comes to policy.
Absolutely. Denise, are you about to get in there as well?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, we have got to rethink what a whole child learning environment really needs to look like. Our children and families are experiencing, and teachers, as Jacob rightly pointed out, are experiencing a new level of trauma. And we need to be thinking about how we can support their social emotional needs, through making sure they have healthy adult relationships, providing supports for teachers in communities of practice so that they know how to deal with this additional stress. And we're also learning, as Jacob said, even from some of the research that we're doing at the Education Trust, that um, if you look at if you choose to use an equity-based lens when it comes to social emotional learning, some of the challenges we sort of need to turn things on their head and think of it from a student-centered approach as opposed to a system-centered approach, whereas we're really thinking of what type of biases are filtering through these type of efforts that are actually not great for the mental health and well-being of students and teachers. And I really hope we are focusing more on, in addition to getting our teachers vaccinated so that they can go back to the classroom, those mental health supports that they will need to be able to effectively and productively support our students when they return to the classroom.
Jacob, how do you think about that challenge with your students? I know that a lot of focus in your school, you really want students to really deeply love themselves and everything that makes them who they are. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, the ability for a national effort, if you will, to be undertaken by the education system when it comes to intervention. I want to first, kind of again highlight what Denise said. Intervention, tutoring shortening the summer, figuring out ways to get more adults, qualified adults in front of students, knowing that in some places in the state of Nevada, even where I just was this past week, you have some classrooms that are teetering on 40 students with one teacher, right? And we already know that even in some cases for students who have high levels of trauma or students who are really struggling at grade level content, that even at 20, right, it can be a tough duty for one person. So doubling that, right, you really got to figure out ways to make classrooms smaller, to make learning pods smaller, intervention groups smaller. And I really do believe we've even seen it here in our school, and definitely seen it in Nevada as well, where you actually see individuals who said, hey, I wasn't really interested in education at first. I just graduated college and I'm interested in potentially being a teaching assistant or being an interventionist based off of the skills they have in reading, math, or science. And when you actually see them sit down with 4 students, 5 students, and watching 7 months of loss turn into 3 months of loss, turn into at grade level, you kind of ask yourself why this isn't becoming a national strategy. So, before I kind of move forward, I just really wanted to say thank you, Denise, for highlighting that. And when we think about identity development, it's very similar to a lot of the other things that we've had to do, which is say, how are we going to turn this into the virtual environment? And the one nice thing that has been really positive about the identity development piece here at Pilot Ed is that while we were asking students to discuss, to research, to kind of challenge things around race, around gender, around sexuality, family structure, some of these things that make our students who they are, we said, let's actually kind of look a little more internally and engage with the home environment. And so there was a lot of storytelling. There were a lot of kind of assignments around the identity development piece of our model where they were interviewing aunts and uncles. They were, going to grandmas because it was the only other person they could see outside of their own mom or their own father. And starting to bring some of these own personal narratives into the classroom, albeit the virtual classroom, but nonetheless the classroom in a way that you don't really have in an in-person environment. It would be nice if we could have 20 grandmothers and 15 uncles in all of the classrooms kind of doing the identity development with our students, but it's actually something that we were able to get in the virtual environment. And we didn't think that was going to be possible. And some of the stories that are coming in, the pictures and family trees and conversations around history have actually added to more of an enriching fabric, if you will, of the identity program here, which has been a pleasant surprise.
Absolutely. And you and Denise also talked about the importance of not only thinking about social emotional learning and mental wellness for students, but also for teachers. And so I'm interested how you've been approaching that with your own educators. So we know that we've seen a lot of headlines about the enormous amount of stress that teachers are under, both trying to teach students at home, and many of them also have their own young people learning at home at the same time.
Some of the things, and I want to make sure that I'm capturing again. So you're asking, what are some of the things around mental health supports that are happening for our teachers as well as our families at home?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things that we've been doing here when it comes to mental health support for our for our families at home as well as for our teachers and really all of our team members is we have a daily kind of mental health kickstart, as we call it, which is about 10 to 15 minutes at the beginning of every day, where when we were completely virtual, this 10 to 15 minute kickstart was done on a video call. And what we were able to do is really open the day with not only a temperature check of, hey, how are all of our team members doing, but more in depth by asking them some more additional questions around, what happened this weekend? What traumatic things have you seen in the virtual environment? How does that make you feel? What are things that we can do as a collective family to kind of get over those things? And what you actually started seeing, especially for some of our newer team members who were like, I'm not used to this virtual environment, and on top of it, I'm not used to this kind of mental health conversation. You started noticing that as some of the more veteran members of Pilot Ed started opening up their mouths and saying, I'm at my wit's end. I don't know what I'm going to do because I have 3 kids at home who are virtual, and I'm trying to balance that, is that you started seeing some of the newer team members kind of open up and say, I'm also struggling. And I think there was power in that because I think we were all able to say, hey, we're not in this alone. And on top of that, we can maybe problem solve together as a community. The second thing we did specifically for our team members, and this was something that we introduced years ago, was something called the mental health stipend. Some people call it their recreation stipend because they use it for things that bring them happiness. But this mental health stipend can be spent on anything for our team members around travel. And if travel's kind of off the table because of COVID, what's that weekend getaway you can do to a state park? Or, do you have a yoga membership? Is there a gym membership? And what we do is we really pay for that. We just pay out of our own pocket to make sure that our team members are well. We know that, the teaching profession is exhausting, and, just trying to give them a little bit something to say, hey, we see you, we appreciate you, and we need you to show up whole every day. Those two kind of tactics, among a lot of other things we've done, have been extremely helpful in making sure that as a team, we are able to kind of weather the storm and move forward together. And when it comes to families, we've had a food pantry since day one at our schools. We've had job fairs and housing assistance and mattress giveaways and clothing giveaways. I mean, we do so many things because we truly do believe, and this again was before the pandemic, we truly believe that schools have to be community centers. I think originally, when you think about the original schoolhouse, it was a community center. It's where parents and family members saw each other before they dropped off their kids. It's where stories of the actual community, of their own community, kind of showed up in the literature. And it's something that, we strive to get back to. And I think this pandemic, where everyone's kind of raising their hand and saying we're struggling, we've used the school to try to be that beacon of light for our families and definitely for our team members as well.
And Denise, I'm wondering, we have a new president and a new Congress, and in fact, President Biden has proposed a stimulus plan that includes $130 billion for K-12 education to get students back into schools who are not already there. Is that enough? What things, should they really be thinking about right now as policymakers to support this transition?
I mean, we at Trust certainly think that's a good start, and there is no doubt that this pandemic has caused a economic loss, both for families, but for state and local governments who are providing significant support to schools. And so they will need this money. They will use this money and to hopefully build back better. But also, right now we're really talking about how do we relieve some of the pressures, and also how do we address the interrupted instruction that students have been dealing with. We certainly hope that some of these funds, and there seems to be a good indication of support, will address this interrupted learning through intensive tutoring, through small groups, through summer programs, through after school programs, through extending the school day, all of which will help us get our students, bring them back in a way that is supportive of them. And I think that's the thing we need to be most mindful of, is how can we support our students during this time to ensure that, out of no fault of their own, they can continue to succeed, continue to thrive, continue to graduate college and career ready, which is, what is so important for this country to stay competitive. So the 130 that $1 billion relief package, we definitely think is a good start, but this pandemic is going to be long lasting, and we're probably going to have to see a few more packages to make sure that we're addressing the impact of the last year.
Absolutely. And you've both given us a lot to think about today, and lots for policymakers to think about and do as we look to making sure that our education system becomes much more equitable, and that we're really meeting the needs of every student, both during this pandemic and beyond. So I would like to thank both of you, Jacob and Denise, for joining us today, and our audience for joining us as well for this important conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dakari.
Thank you for having me.